Good morning, everybody. It's good to be back in Birmingham. We came 2 years ago to present the beginnings of our research project that we had on outsourcing and the management of safety in those relationships. And this is comes at the end of that process of that project, and I want to report back on what we found to give you some good insights, I hope, into the ways that you can be more effective in the management of health and safety in those relationships. It's also good to be back in Birmingham. I was here 2 weeks ago at a conference, British Academy of Management conference. I'm an academic at Cranfield University, and I'm on the executive committee for that community. And that was an exciting event, 1,000 delegates over 5 days. We had a great time, and it was very comfortable. I come here this morning amongst a community of practitioners and policymakers, and it's a wholly different experience. From my point of view, it's much more nerve-wracking standing up here talking to you than it was talking to the people at Aston a few weeks ago. And that's why I've brought Ken. Ken is my bodyguard to protect me from any conflicts that might arise, but he's also my interpreter, because he will actually take what I've said in the first half of this presentation and make it intelligible to you. I hope through a case study that's relevant to your experience, and from between us then we can actually bridge this academic practitioner divide and actually have a proper dialogue about some of the things I've been talking about and communicate some of the messages from our research project to you more effectively. So that's the plan for the session. Let's begin with a story. You know the story about that accident, the story about the fatality, the story about the release of asbestos, and the fact that it was a contractor or a subcontractor or a subcontractor. And that's been your experience, or an experience of one of your colleagues, or you know somebody that's had that experience. And I suspect some of you in the room can relate to that quite clearly, quite effectively. But there's also another story that goes alongside that. And the story is the contractor, because of their experience in the topic that you've outsourced, in the role that you've outsourced, because of their breadth of knowledge across different sectors, different experiences, they bring something to you that you learn from and you benefit from. And so there's these two conflicting stories that go around about contractors and outsourcing and whether they're effective and how easy it is to manage them. And it was that debate between those 2 points of view that got me thinking about the role of contractors and how you manage them. And I persuaded IOSH, and through your subscriptions to IOSH, to fund the research program that we were able to engage with. So thank you for supporting us, and I hope you'll find that it's useful in the long, in 40 minutes time or so. But that raises the issue, and I've seen the data on this from a number of different organisations, where you have a spread. Some contractors are good, and some contractors are less good in their performance of safety management. And so we can say a contractor is not a contractor, They're not all the same. And yet we treat them very much as that's the case. Clearly there is a difference. Some are individuals working for themselves or for small and medium-sized enterprises, but some are large multinational firms. And yet we use the same label to describe them. They're all contractors. And as I said, they perform in very different ways. Some are good, some are less good, and you all have experiences of that. And it seems to me, from thinking about this problem, that we need a more sophisticated way of understanding and differentiating between contractors of different types. And I guess if you thought about it for a moment, and I come from a university with a business school, you would expect us to produce a 2x2. That would be quite a familiar thing for most of you who've had any engagement with management schools, that they teach in 2x2 matrices. And I think there's a 2x2 matrix that begins to help us differentiate between different sorts of contractors. And if we focus on the task that the contractors perform, we can have two different dimensions. The first to think about is the strategic value to your organisation of the task that they're performing. So what value do they bring, and how important is it to your organisation? Is it a core activity that they're performing, or is it something that's peripheral? Has it high significance for the strategic value of your organisation, or low significance? So there's one dimension that you can begin to differentiate the way contractors work. The second dimension is to do with the scope of the task that you've asked them to perform. Is it a routine task? Is it a task that many other people could perform? Or is it much more complex, bespoke, and significant to and requiring a high degree of skills that can't be readily accessed in other places? So you have this 2x2 matrix. In the bottom left-hand corner, you've got activities that are of low strategic value, that are routinely performed, and typically we manage those by a contractual relationship where we monitor them closely, as opposed to the top right-hand box where they're performing tasks that are core to the business and are complex in their requirements, and often those sorts of tasks are managed much more relationally. So we have this 2x2 arrangement that we think actually applies to contractor relationships and allows us to begin to differentiate them. And this is what we talked to you about last time we were here. Just to give you some examples of what that might mean. So you can see different role types, different activities performed in each of those different quadrants. And I think that gives you some flavour of how these differ, and you may wish to reflect on your own contractor relationships and see where you place them in relation to the positions on those grids. And the question then is, do you manage them in the same way or in different ways? And what we want to go on to talk about is to suggest that maybe you need to think about managing them differently from the point of view of health and safety. So just to pause there, and just think about also what is it how you might characterize those four different quadrants. So in the top left-hand quadrant, it might be around doing things quickly. You want somebody to actually perform that routine task, and because it's got high value, to do it rapidly. In the bottom left-hand corner, it might be to do it right. You want the people who are doing routine tasks, peripheral tasks, to perform the job as you expect them to, reasonably enough. Do it first. In the top right-hand box, that's where your competitive advantage lies. So you'd want to be ahead of the curve, ahead of the game, ahead of the competitors. And then do it together in the bottom right-hand corner. So just to summarise then, with what we're saying is that we think contractors are not a homogeneous group. It's unhelpful to think of them in that way, and you perhaps need a more differentiated way of thinking about them. And we suggest using this matrix, which is what we've used during our project over the last 2 years. So we ran an event at Cranfield and got a number of organisations to come along, and some of them volunteered to take part. And two of them in particular, one from the pharma company in blue there, and not to be stereotypical, in yellow, the engineers on the quadrant, and Ken represents some of that, and we'll talk to you about that in a minute. We also had a logistics company that took part in a pilot study, and also some people from the energy sector. So those were the distributions that we felt were present in our studies over the last 2 or 3 years of the relationships between the client and the contractor. Now at this point, I would anticipate you're expecting me to give you the answers to what do you do differently in each of those 4 quadrants, for you to take home that message so that you can identify it. Well, why would I do that? That's too straightforward, that's too simple, and as an academic we like to make things complicated. So I'm going to give you a model and tell you something a bit different about what's going on. We, as part of the project, had an advisory group, industrial advisory group. Some of the members are sitting in the audience, and I'm expecting questions from them later. And during one of those meetings, one of them mentioned the notion of systems thinking. And that made me go away and do some reading and some further research and some reflections. And it made me think about the notion of boundaries. And it dawned on me, not surprisingly, and it's pretty obvious when you think about it, that when you have an outsourcing relationship, you introduce a new boundary into your organisation. Either you bring one in, or you shift an existing boundary from where it was into a new position. And so this idea of boundaries becomes really quite important for thinking about how we engage with outsourcing. There seems to me to be three different ways in which outsourcing impacts and creates a boundary in your organisation. And it has to do with these three things. So it has to do with doing, has to do with being, and it has to do with thinking. So let me explain. When you have a difference between two entities with the boundary in the middle around the way you do things, the activities, the processes, the regulations, the procedures, the structures, that creates a different way of working between the two entities on either side of the boundary. So there's a difference. So what we do and how we do it, if that's different across either side of the boundary, that will create problems. A second area where there's a problem is when you find a different set of values on the other side of the boundary to the ones that you hold. So the way you think about things, the beliefs you have, the values you hold, when you run up against another organisation at the boundary, that creates a problem. And it was interesting that Paul this morning introduced that from the perspective of the HSE around the values that people have in organisations, and with the changing demographic that he referred to in his talk, clearly this is something that's going to increase, I think. The third area where there's the potential for a boundary is around the notion of being. So how are we? How do we behave? What language do we use on either side of the boundary? What are the uniforms like? What are the social norms that we hold between either side? And so where those differ, you get a difference in being on either side. So we have these three different elements, if you like, that we need to take into account when we approach a boundary and try to manage across those boundaries. And if we just think about that a little bit more, we can pay attention. If we pay attention to only two of them at a time, but ignore the third, we still have problems. So if we pay attention to doing and thinking, so the processes and the rules that we follow, the values and beliefs that we had, but don't pay attention to the social norms, the language we use, the way we express things, then we still don't have an alignment. So we have no common identity, no shared norms. Thinking about the failure to think together, then we have no shared beliefs. Although we might work well, we might have complementary processes, we might have the similar language, we might have the same uniforms. Again, that might lead to differences because we don't share the same beliefs. And similarly around, if we pay attention to what we believe and we speak in the same language but have different processes and procedures, then again, that causes problems. And we saw each of those three challenges in the research relationships that we investigated as part of the project. Thinking about the shared being, no common identity. What do you do with TUPID staff, people who get moved from one contract to the next contract? Whose values do they have? Do they have your values? Do they have the values of the client organisation that they work for now, or the values of the client organisation they worked for before? Whose values are they owning? What is their identity, and how does it relate to yours? Similarly, if you've got organisations operating in multiple sites, so you've got multiple sites with contractor relationships between two big organisations, what happens across those sites? Do they have the same ways of behaving, the same language, the same uniform, and is there consistency and complementarity? Some of the challenges we observed on the project. Shared thinking. What happens when there's a difference between the way the headquarters engages with the other headquarters of the other firm and the way the local staff engage with each other on site? Is there a difference there? How does that work out? Do they have different ways of do they have different ways of thinking? Do they have different values? How much do they hold each other in esteem and value what each other does? And perhaps the third one around doing, a couple of examples there. What happens when the headquarters of the two organisations are in different legal jurisdictions? And so you then end up with CDM challenges in the UK that the headquarters of the contracting organisation don't recognise and don't respond to because they're based in the US. Interesting problems, interesting challenges, no shared way of working. And similarly, what about reporting incidents and accidents? It creates duplication of effort. We have a system, you have a system. The people involved at the sharp end have to input into both sets of systems. Are there no common way of working, no similar processes? So these things are evident in the way we manage health and safety. So thinking, being and doing influence the way we manage health and safety in our relationships across these different outsourcing opportunities. And so the argument that we would want to make is there's a sweet spot where you have alignment in the way you do things, where you have alignment in the way you behave, the being, who you are, where you have alignment in the thinking, the values and the beliefs that you hold, then there's an opportunity for outsourcing to work really effectively. But where any one of those things is missing, then you create challenges, and challenges occur. I'm going to hand over now to Ken to explain really what I've been saying for the last 20 minutes, and hopefully to bring it to life with a case study from his experience, and then I'll come back with some more suggestions at the end. Ken.
Thanks very much, Colin. He's the intelligent one. Now you got the numpty. It's great working with Colin and the team. Really fantastic, and it's really helped us in our business. We used the model in one of our projects, and to give you an idea what this project is and how we've tried to translate that thinking into some practical way to move forward. We're currently building Keadby 2 combined cycle power station near Scunthorpe. Big project for us, 350 million. One of the few power stations that is actually being built now, and we probably need to build some more. That's a plug to get us some more work. But the lights may go off, folks, as they did the other week, unless we build some more. So really key critical, absolutely. So what is it made up of? Well, it's made up of a German contract teams. It's a German project, Siemens Germany, with interesting dynamics between us in the UK, because we are the legal people in the UK that signed the contract, so that makes an interesting dynamic. We are principal designer in the UK and principal contractor, so no pressure. And then we have lots of contractors as well, and one of them is our civils partner. So what do we want from that civils partner? What kind of relationship do we want? How do we use these models to actually bring that to life? Well, traditionally, what we've tended to do is throw in the EHS team, and say, have you got health and safety policy? Did you sign it? Is it in date? Yes, tick. Have you got a risk assessment? Can you do risk assessments? Are they okay? Yes, tick. Is everybody wearing PPE on site? It's a housekeeping, not bad. Yes, tick. And you can go on and on and on the tick list. And please don't think that I'm devaluing what some of our EHS people do, because I think it's important. But actually what it tells me is that we're kind of doing the things right. And to be honest, if we're not doing that, we shouldn't be in business anyway. So what should our relationship be like? So a part of this tender award process was a series, not of interviews, but conversations. And it was mandated in the final four for the contractors that I sat down with, along with a colleague of mine, with the managing director or the CEO and the operations director, and if they wanted to, they could bring an EHS person along. But it was not mandatory, because the conversations were not to do with our relationship with EHS. So this was kind of strange to some of our contractors. And what we wanted to do was provoke conversations, because we wanted to understand their culture, and we wanted them to understand our culture, and we wanted to see that we could work in partnership. We did not want bun fights on the site at Keighley, because that's too late. So let's set it up to succeed and have our relationships already in place. Yeah, we're still going to get issues, but it's on the right road to solving issues as they come up. So, for example, EHS policy. We asked the managing director or the CEO, well, we've seen your policy, you signed it, oh, and guess what? It's in date. But what does it actually mean to you? How do you put all of these, or this content into this policy? What's your influence? You signed it. It's like signing a check. So what does it mean to you? And this opened up a whole world of conversations. We asked if we went round your company and we just picked on somebody and said, do you know what your roles and responsibilities are? What would they say to us? How do you get that over to people? More than just posting it on a notice board. What does it mean? How is it alive and kicking in your business? What is the management commitment? So what's your commitment, and what is your senior team commitment into the business to do with health and safety? And it was amazing, the conversations that we had. There was talk around their safety programs, and we asked them, do you know about Siemens Zero Harm? And some of them disappointingly said yes, and that's because of us. Because we're absolute rubbish when we send out a tender to say, and by the way, we've got a Zero Harm program, and this is what it means. So they didn't know. So this was us holding our hands up and saying, we're not that good either. Can we have a conversation about what it means to us? And how do you think that lands in your business? We also talked about health and well-being. You know, what does that mean with you? Are you doing anything around mental health? Colin mentioned incident reporting. Well, what's your take on that? So there's a whole load of open-ended questions that got us into some really interesting and rich conversations. And we wanted to walk out of that meeting so that they know who we are and we know who they are, and we can form a partnership, which is absolutely key critical to delivering Keighley 2. Because without that, we could get into all kinds of problems. Some of the interesting conversations where you would expect a company to come up with a brochure and say, here's our brochure, what do you think of this? And one of them, who's actually quite a big civils contractor in the UK, on the last page of the brochure had health and safety. And yet the CEO said, it's my number one priority. Oh, that's great. Can you explain why it's on the last page of your brochure and not on the first page? And that set off a conversation. You know, we were not being critical or finger pointing. We wanted to have a great relationship. The last time Colin and I stood up here, we said contractors are not second-class citizens, and we should not treat them as such. We want to treat them as partners. And that was the idea of this. And we came out with some great conversations. And I said tongue-in-cheek, you know what? We know where you live. So if you get it, we can come back and see you. But it's that relationship and getting that, which is key critical to Colin's model here. Without that, and just going down the normal tick box exercise, we are probably not going to build meaningful relationships between ourselves and our contractors. So that's just one example, and I've skimmed through it, but the secret is that when you sit in front of your contractors and alongside of them, having open-ended questions to have that rich conversation. It's amazing what we learnt in Siemens and actually took some best practice away, and it's amazing what they learnt as well. So I'm going to hand back to Colin, because there's another step to go as yet.
Thanks, Ken. So Ken has just given you a bit of an example there of where he's actually been using those two frameworks, the 2x2 matrix and the 3 circles, to begin to understand what's the nature of the contracting relationship they have, where do they fit in the broad spectrum of contractors, and then unpacking that in terms of understanding how do we interact with them and engage with them in the different way. One thing I forgot to show you was this slide, which is what you really wanted to know, is how do those 3 circles relate to our findings in the project. You remember that slide from earlier where we've got the different relationships in the different case studies that we've employed during the 2 years of the research that we were investigating. And what we found was, if you relate it to our 3 circles, as you go from bottom left to top right through that curve, you find that the alignment around the thinking, the doing and the being becomes much more aligned. There's much less friction between those 3 things as you move from bottom left to top right. So paying attention to those 3 things in all their manifestations through conversations with your partner organisations becomes really key to effectively managing safety and health in outsourced relationships. Ken's just talked to you about that. So what are the actions then from all that you've been listening to for the last half an hour? I think the first thing to say is think very carefully about why you're outsourcing. Outsourcing introduces risk. Do you understand what risks you're introducing? Do you need to introduce those things, and why are you doing it? So that's the first thing to go away and think about in any of your things, future discussions with contractors. If you have contractors, then think about the alignment that you have across that boundary between the 2 organisations in terms of the thinking, the being and the doing, those 3 different perspectives on this boundary, and have a discussion. Don't try and dismiss it with a tick box checklist approach that says, yes, we've talked about this, we've done this, we've got these things in place. Have that conversation, that ongoing dialogue to ensure that you're working effectively together. And the third thing that's really important and unashamed here, we've got a finale event for the project at Cranfield on the 5th of November. It'd be great if as many of you could come as want to. It's a free event. We'll provide you lunch, but let me know if you're coming, because otherwise you won't have any food. But if you want to debate some of this a bit more, work out how those frameworks work, how they might be applied in your business, try and disaggregate what your contractors are like, and what does it mean to think, do and believe and behave in your relationships, so that you have an effective relationship. What does that look like? What does thinking, being and doing mean for you in your contracting relationships? I would love you to be there to be part of that debate, that discussion, so that we can begin to earth that with some actual practices that you find useful in undertaking those outsourced relationships. So please let me know. Please come to Cranfield on the 5th of November. It'd be great to have you there, and we'll take some questions.
Okay, we have had some questions on Slido, but I'd like to sort of differentiate between Slido and the floor. So are there any questions from the floor, first of all? Does anybody want to be brave? Yeah, one at the front here.
I don't know about being brave. Darren Brunton, IOSH Chairman for the Singapore branch. A really good 2 presentations, thanks very much. And I can really associate with it being coming from the offshore oil and gas industry, where they do continuously subcontract down, and the risk is way down the road. So the first one, can you go back to your slide, the bottom right-hand quadrant?
Yeah.
If you could, you did name it, I think. I just want to get a clarification there, actually.
Next one back.
So number 4.
Yep.
What was that there was a name in each of the boxes, and I thought number 4 was working together.
Oh, right. Yeah, yes, it was. Yeah.
So why, I mean, what you explained was you work together with your contractors in developing and assessing them. But why isn't there more collaboration from your findings in how contractors and clients work together? That's the first question. The second one would be, is your research paper going to be available?
It will be available. It will be a long and weighty tome to satisfy IOSH, and Duncan is sat in the room here, so he will edit it. There will be a summary, executive summary of a couple of thousand words that will come out towards the end of this year once it's been approved by IOSH. So, yes, that will be available, and it will be on the IOSH website. In answer to your first question, what we struggle to find people who would actually fit in that bottom right-hand quadrant, wouldn't characterise their relationships in that space. So the slide I showed you at the beginning with those different job roles in those spaces, and my supposition is those might be the attitudes that people might take to working in that space, was that the job roles were defined and have been evidenced. The suppositions, the do it first, do it fast, do it together, were ways of behaving that I thought might be relevant. I'm happy to take the critique that maybe that's not true, and maybe that's not what we said we wanted to see overall, that we work together. But I think the evidence from the work that we've got so far is that people are, as you move to the top right, and recognising we don't have any data in the bottom left, that there is much more alignment between organisations and between the way they work together more effectively as you go from bottom left to top right. Does that answer your question?
No, thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. We'll take one from Slido. John Waite has asked, is recognising the gaps more important than hitting the sweet spot? So I think that refers to the diagram that you had earlier.
Well, yeah, I think so. You know, before you can hit the sweet spot, you've got to recognise the gaps, and you really have got to get into your organisation. And if you look at Siemens, I said the last time, we're the awkward customers. We're hugely complex. And what sort of works with the matrix in one business unit or division is completely the opposite. And we seem to be morphing into different worlds where we seem to be more into the outsourcing world. And it's understanding why we're doing it and the risks, which is really what Colin was saying with his what next, and understanding those gaps, then you can start to work together to hit that sweet spot.
Is there a question from the floor? I think this hand here went up first, just over here. We're going to make you run around now.
Thank you. Craig Purcell, I also work in the oil and gas industry. I'm interested, as you were sort of using this as part of the procurement process, I mean, I'm very used to actually having to adhere to a bid evaluation plan where you develop the criteria for evaluation before you receive any bids back and everything like that. How do you align a process that is a lot more subjective with evaluation criteria where you have to demonstrate your decisions to your project partners?
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm also in oil and gas as well, working for BP and different customers. What we've tended to do quite often is say, well, it's kind of compliance, you know, and then sort of going off a bit of a tangent and saying, well, we'll look at compliance and then we'll look to see if there's practical ways that they can demonstrate compliance. And when I say we, talking about Siemens, is we were not good at, well, what should the relationship be like? You know, we would allow bun fights to develop, say, on a project at a low level, and, you know, our senior people to get away scot-free. And then they would just have a nice, cozy chat at the top. But actually, it's all of us. So it's understanding those relationships. So that's why we went on beyond compliance to say, what is the partnership? What do we want out of this partnership? And that started driving these other conversations.
Another question from Slido. Ken, during your conversations with contractors, if you found they did not have all the shared elements, how did that affect the selection process?
Yeah, that's interesting, because it was a tough conversation in Germany that I had that said, you know, it was almost if you're going to join the golf club and somebody drops in the black ball, you know, into the receptacle, and if they pulled out the black ball, you didn't get in. Well, it was very much like that. We said if we cannot form a partnership and things are not right between us, we would have a casting vote on this, and it wouldn't happen. Now, one thing we did do was we did a full report back to the project team, but we also shared the highlights of that with the contractor as well. Okay, so there was some learning on both sides. But at the end of the day, if we can't form a partnership, and maybe it's us because we're just so awkward, or maybe it's a contractor who's not right for this type of work, we have to stand up and not get into a failed partnership before we start.
And questions from the floor? Hans just over here has just gone up. Yep.
Thanks very much. It's a really interesting kind of presentation. I like the 4 quadrants. I'm curious to understand how this differs from, say, a kind of a partnership model that you'd have in high-risk industry where you have bridging documents, and then what the opposite would be for some of those other quadrants. Because Ken, you outlined having curious conversations with contractors and forming the kind of the norming process about shared values and shared approaches. When we look at the other 4 quadrants, can you give me an overview of what's different in those other quadrants?
I'll give a couple and then let Colin speak. So, if you look at the bottom left-hand one, that could be, for example, we're going to bring in new office cleaners, into a Siemens office block. We would most certainly not have the kind of conversations that we had with our main civils partner. But we still got to recognise that they're doing a piece of work and they're a part of us. But we would approach it slightly differently. I know Duncan's sitting behind you there, and he talked long and hard about risk, and I think we're aligned on that. There's an element of risk in here, so what is the risk factor as well? And the matrix allows you to explore risk.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, how it relates to other models. I'm not sure we've actually gone to explore that, because the reason being is that what we were trying to do was to get people to actually think about for themselves in their context about how they might view the contractor that they were dealing with, because each of you will have a different appreciation of what strategic value is for your organisation, and it would be wrong for me especially, to begin to say, this is how you should put numbers or a measure on that scale. But it's a mechanism for giving you a tool to think about how there might be difference. And again, on the complexity of the task, again, that's going to be contextually specific. So it's a heuristic device, if you like, for you in your organisation with your top management team or whoever is making those decisions to say, what sorts of contractors do we have? Where do they fit in this complex world? They're not all the same, because that's typically how they're portrayed, and that's typically how advice is given. You have a document that says this is how you manage contractors in the chemical industry, which is where the document was taken from. I suspect that not all contractors are the same even in that space. And so although the information may be helpful, it's not always useful to allowing you to do that. So it was really a tool to say, actually, can we generate a conversation and help you have a proper conversation about how you see your contractors, how you think they should be managed, what are the appropriate risks in those different quadrants, and what are the implications for health and safety management in that space. And that's where Ken has used it very effectively within Siemens. So that's sort of how we saw it being used.
To just add one thing to that, I mentioned about cleaners coming in. They're not key critical coming in to clean a Siemens office. If you had a laboratory, then the cleaners are key critical. So you can't just label cleaners as, well, they go in that corner. It's exactly what Colin's saying. You know, you have to understand your business and the risks and why you've got contractors. And that model allows you to move around and rather than put people into corners.
Okay, thank you. Paul Haxall has asked, what is the key differentiator in your 2x2 model, which means it will prove more successful than other partnerships or collaboration models than have gone before?
Well, I think I've just sort of alluded to that. I think actually it's you can use it in whatever context you want to. So it might apply in oil and gas, but the way you apply it in oil and gas will be very different to the way you might apply it in a retail setting, to the way you might apply it in a legal firm or in a construction organisation. So it gives you the flexibility to play with it, and that's why we think it's useful. That's why I think it's useful, rather than having this is how you do it, which then creates the blue tape agenda, because everybody expects you to have that particular way of working without actually being thoughtful about whether it's appropriate or not. And that just as Paul was saying this morning, that's one of the problems that exists at the moment. People are expecting people to behave in a particular way because everybody else does. Let's have a little more sophistication in our thinking about how we actually manage these contractors.
We've got time for one more brief question from the floor. Gentleman just here.
Yeah, thanks so much for all the presentations. Really very thought-provoking. In my earlier days in oil and gas, we dealt with this challenge in agreeing on an interface document where we look at the gaps ab initio between the bigger company engaging a contractor, and then sometimes the other contractor are equally big, depending on the risk level and what they do. But some of the challenges I tend to come across nowadays is where that is there, but there is a gap in procurement, contractual procurement, where it's not being made very clear as to what the expectation is for the contractor in the procurement or contractual document. And so whilst you try to make this understanding or come to let them understand what you expect from them, they go about interpreting it in the way it's been put in the contract, which is kind of usually a bit different. Have you got a view in the balance of, yes, us having an understanding with them, but also looking at what is contractually provided for? Is my question clear?
Yeah, I think so.
We've got 1 minute.
Okay, we've got 1 minute to answer, really. Well, I think to summarise that, actually, and Colin and I have talked long and hard about this as well, you know, we need to, within our businesses, establish partnerships. You know, so EHS, supply chain management, operations, you know, all the way through. You know, we are all there to deliver a project. You know, Kiwi doesn't get delivered unless we're all aligned through all the support functions, through the people that actually do the hard work and earn us the money. So we've got to be more collaborative and understand each other's sort of areas and work together within this model to make it successful. You know, we can't just be, well, it's just contracts, or it's just sales, you know, or it's just the CEO wants to sign it, you know, or it's just EHS. We're all in it together. And hopefully this model starts to open up those conversations.
Colin, did you just want one last message?
Come to Cranfield on the 5th of November.
There you go. You've heard it here. If we could give our speakers thanks in the normal way, and you'll be going to your next sessions.
Thank you.